Hello, I'm Brad Stevanovic. Let us review the anatomy of the lower extremity arterial system. We will start with the main artery of the lower limb, the femoral artery. Also known as the common femoral artery, is a continuation of the external iliac artery, which is also the terminal branch of the abdominal aorta, as seen on the screen here. The external iliac artery becomes the common femoral artery when it crosses the inguinal ligament, which on this diagram is around this area here. It has 5 branches: the superficial iliac circumflex, which we can see on the top left hand on the screen here, the superficial epigastric, which we see on the top right here, the superficial external pedental, just below it, the deep external pedental, which is just below it again, and the deep femoral artery. As we cross the inguinal ligament, we enter the femoral triangle, where the profunda femoris artery originates from the posterolateral aspect of the common femoral artery, which we see just over here. After which the common femoral artery has now become the superficial femoral artery. The profunda femoris artery travels posteriorly and distally, giving off 3 main branches: the lateral external femoral circumflex artery, which wraps around the anterior lateral side of the femur, and it supplies the muscles of the lateral aspect of the thigh through its 3 branches: the descending branch, the ascending branch, and the transverse branch. We also have the medial or internal femoral circumflex artery, which goes around the posterior side of the femur, supplying its neck and head. It branches into the ascending branch and a transverse branch. This transverse branch anastomoses with the transverse branch of the lateral femoral circumflex. Lastly, we have the perforating branches that perforate the adductor magnus, contributing to the supply of the muscles in the medial and posterior thigh. After exiting the femoral triangle, this area here, the superficial femoral artery continues down the anterior surface of the thigh via a tunnel known as the adductor canal, as we can see here. During its descent, the artery supplies the anterior thigh muscles. The adductor canal ends at an opening in the adductor magnus, which is known as the adductor hiatus. The superficial femoral artery moves through the opening and enters the posterior compartment of the thigh. At this point, the superficial femoral artery has terminated into the popliteal artery. Right before the superficial femoral artery terminates into the popliteal, the descending genicular artery, as seen here, branches off into 2 separate arteries. These are known as the saphenous descending genicular artery and the articular descending genicular artery, which anastomoses around the knee joint. Whilst the femoral artery is the primary artery of the thigh, vessels that arise from the internal iliac artery also supply the thigh and gluteals. The obturator artery, which you can see here in the diagram, branches from the internal iliac artery in the pelvis, where it descends through the obturator canal and enters the medial thigh, where it then branches into the anterior and posterior obturator artery. The anterior branch supplies the pectineus, obturator externus, the adductor muscles, and the gracilis. The posterior branch supplies some of the deep gluteal muscles. The gluteal region is largely supplied by the superior and inferior gluteal arteries. These arteries also branch from the internal iliac artery, entering the gluteal region via the greater sciatic foramen. The superior gluteal artery leaves the foramen above the piriformis muscle. The inferior gluteal leaves below the piriformis muscle. In addition to the gluteal muscles, the inferior gluteal artery also contributes towards the vasculature of the posterior thigh. We now move down to the leg and foot, where you will recall earlier I mentioned that the superficial femoral artery terminates into the popliteal artery, as we can see here. The popliteal artery descends the posterior thigh, giving rise to the genicular branches that I mentioned earlier that supply the knee joint. The popliteal moves through the popliteal fossa, exiting between the gastrocnemius muscles and the popliteus muscles. At the lower border of the popliteus The popliteal artery terminates by dividing into the anterior tibial artery and the tibio-peroneal trunk. In turn, the tibio-peroneal trunk bifurcates into the posterior tibial and fibular arteries. The anterior tibial artery passes anteriorly between the tibia and fibula through a gap in the interosseous membrane. It then moves inferiorly down the leg. It runs down the entire length of the leg and into the foot, where it becomes the dorsalis pedis artery, as seen in this diagram here. The dorsalis pedis artery passes over the dorsal aspect of the tarsal bones and then moves inferiorly towards the sole of the foot. It then anastomoses with the lateral plantar artery to form the deep plantar arch. The dorsalis pedis artery supplies the tarsal bones and the dorsal aspect of the metatarsals via the deep plantar arch. It also contributes to the supply of the toes. The posterior tibial artery continues inferiorly along the surface of the deep posterior leg muscles, such as the tibialis posterior. The posterior tibial artery enters the sole of the foot through the tarsal tunnel accompanying the tibial nerve, then splits into the lateral and medial plantar arteries. These arteries supply the plantar side of the foot and contribute to the supply of the toes via the deep plantar arch. The fibula or peroneal artery descends posteriorly to the fibula within the posterior compartment of the leg. It gives rise to perforating branches which penetrate the intramuscular septum to supply muscles in the lateral compartment of the leg. As it progresses down into the foot, the fibular artery branches around the calcaneus of the foot. That concludes a basic overview of lower limb arterial anatomy. Now we will move on to a basic overview of lower limb arterial physiology.